Today we are talking to Sophie Hughes as a part of our International Booker 2025 series. Her translation of Vincenzo Latronico's Perfection was shortlisted this year. It's the first book that she translated from Italian into English. Sophie Hughes is a literary translator from Spanish and Italian and is the most nominated translator in the 10-year history of International Booker Prize. Her translations have been longlisted or shortlisted for 5 times. She is the judge for the International Booker Prize in the coming year 2026. She is the translator of more than 20 novels. She has been shortlisted for the Dublin Literary Award and the Valle Inclán Prize, and in 2021, she was awarded the Queen Sofía Translation Prize. She has also worked with the Stephen Spender Trust to promote translation in schools and is the co-editor of the anthology Europa 28, Writing by Women on the Future of Europe, published in 2020 in collaboration with Hay Festival. We thank International Booker Prize for arranging this interview. Here she is talking about her journey into translation.
My journey begins quite late in a sense because I grew up monolingual, and I always thought that English was my language. And in many ways it is. In a simple way, English is my language. It's my first language. But I suppose I started to doubt that it was as mine as I thought it was when I first moved abroad to a country with another language, which was to Spain. And as I got better at Spanish and speaking in Spanish, I sort of felt myself in all these different contexts of speaking, and I recognized a different me as I spoke in this second language. And I'm not sure I thought of these things consciously, but I do think that once you've lived abroad and tried to express yourself on a day-to-day basis in another language, you do come to see English differently and your relationship to it. Often, especially with Italian for me, often I feel like I'm much more at myself and at home in English. In the case of living in Mexico, I often felt more myself speaking in Spanish with my friends in Mexico in sort of Mexican Spanish. So that there was this monolingualism to start with, but always a lot of reading, a lot of literature in my house. Not because anyone was had literary jobs really. It was just my mum loves reading novels and poetry. My dad was a doctor, so didn't have much time for it. But there were just books around as children. And I think, probably one of the most bookish of the 6 siblings. I'm the youngest of 6 children. So these were all hand-me-down books, but I just seemed to need them in some way. I think maybe there was an element of wanting to escape a little bit from the madness, because living in a household with 6 children is quite mad sometimes. Someone said to me about 5 years ago when I explained that I was the youngest of 6, they said, "Oh, well, it all makes sense." I said, "What makes sense?" And they said, "Well, that's why you're a translator." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you never got a chance to speak, but you must have done a lot of listening." Because I think it's true that you have to listen closely. That's probably the thing you have to do most closely, is listen to try and hear what the author was saying and intending to get across, and then copy it. So I thought that was funny. So anyway, monolingual. And then I started learning Spanish in my early 20s, sort of late teens, early 20s, just by moving there. I didn't actually know any Spanish when I moved to Spain, and I think that was great because I just learnt it by speaking. And I studied a little bit on the side. And then I came back to the UK, and my first encounter with literary translation at all was through the translations of Margaret Jewel Costa, who translates many Nobel authors from Spanish and Portuguese, and incredibly, well, she's just absolutely amazing. There's not really anyone to sort of match her in terms of the quality of her translations, I think. And I read her translations of Javier Marías while I'd been doing a lot of reading of him in Spanish. And I just couldn't believe how she was doing it. I couldn't believe that there was no difference to me between reading these books in Spanish and in English. I knew his voice so well in Spanish, and then I read her English, and I felt like I was still reading him. She was Marías, and he was her, and it was just extraordinary. And I honestly found it so enlightening that because I realized how much writing is involved, how she needed to be as good a writer as he in one way. She's not doing the making up of plots and characters and things, but she has to be able to write. She has to be able to pull off the quality of sentences that I found he was doing in Spanish, and she absolutely was, if not improving them. And that's in his words as well as in mine. Javier Marias, who died last year, I think, the year before, and he always said that, that she improves his work. And so that was that. And then I was still not translating. I just realized that what translation was, and I became a bit less sort of ignorant around it. And then I started reading for a literary scout. I was working as an assistant literary agent to a sort of quite commercial literary agency. And on the side, they said it was fine if I did these book reports. So I was reading books from Spain and from Latin America for the scout then to give reports to her clients. And I read one day a book called The Boy Who Stole Attila's Horse by a writer called Ivan Rapila. And I loved it so much that I wanted to share it with people. So there's a bit of a cliche, but it is also true that I just really thought, how is this book not sold? So I wrote to the agent. It was very helpful that I worked for a literary agency, because I didn't find any of that aspect particularly difficult or awkward or uncomfortable. I just knew that good agents want to talk about books. So I really wrote her just an email saying how amazing this book I thought was, and does the translation exist? And if it doesn't, why not? And so we started working together, and I did a sample, and Adam Freudenheim at Pushkin Press bought the book. And at that point I said, oh, that's great, wonderful, congratulations to everyone involved, thinking that my job had been that, because I was working in a literary agency. I thought that really my job was over. And then Adam said, no, we want you to translate the book. So I had been translating, but very much in the closet, and I'd been really enjoying it. And I'd published one or two things, one of which actually was published when Jacques Testard was still an editor of the White Review. And he was one of the first people to publish me as well, without any sort of question about whether or not it was okay for an absolute novice of a translator to be published in the review. And Adam Freudenheim was the same. He said, well, we bought it off the basis of your English, of your translation. So yes, we would like you to do it. And that was the start, really. That was the journey into translation.
The other interesting part is you also supported creative translations through Stephen Spender's Trust.
Yes, so the Stephen Spender Trust, one of the things that it does, a sort of branch of it, it's there to create educational programs largely within schools and outside of schools as well.
Sorry, this is in the UK.
This is in the UK, yes, exactly. And in 2017 or 18, I think, I worked with them a little bit later than that, but I think that's when they began the creative translation in the classroom program, which was a sort of range of initiatives, workshops, training programs, where they would put literary translators, into British school classroom settings. One is to kind of promote language learning, but the other was also to help, or just simply to show many of the bilingual and trilingual school children in Britain, because of which there are so many, to almost to kind of show them, well, you have this skill that you're sitting on, and you might not realize that the fact that you speak Gujarati at home and English, in the rest of your world or at school, you speak a bit of this and a bit of that. You don't even know that is a skill. And it's something that other people work very hard, a skill other people work for years and years to have. So it was a way of, there was a sort of social benefit to it in that way, but largely it was there to show that language acquisition was not something that had a purpose. There was a practical purpose to it, potentially, if it was something that they were interested in as well. So we were there when we went into the classrooms. We would run these workshops with school children and show them what the craft of translation was, always trying to give really engaging examples. I remember once there was a play from Mexico, current play that a friend of mine had written about a family who'd had to migrate due to sort of the violent situation in their own country. And when they get to the border, when they move to this new country, we don't know where it is. It's unnamed. So there's no language attached to it. The border police start speaking to them in a language that they don't know. And this made up language somehow you're able to understand what he's saying, despite the fact that it's completely made up. And so we would look at a scene from that play, for example, and try to teach or to show children how much you can infer from body language, from intonation, and things like that, and which are all things that we do when we translate literature. And so it was so fascinating trying to find ways to show them without showing them. They weren't old enough to sit and do a literary translation class. And there was obviously the other idea was to increase kind of intercultural awareness as well. And yeah, that was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, it sounds really wonderful.
Yeah.
See, your work has been recognized by the International Booker repeatedly. Over the last 10 years, you have been either shortlisted or longlisted 5 times. This time again, your translation perfection got shortlisted. Now it talks about a couple of things. One thing, of course, is the quality of your translation and about the choice of the books too. So the question is, my question is, how do you choose which books to translate?
There are two parts to this answer, because it's changed over time. When I first started translating, nobody knew who I was, and there is still, but there was an enormous pool of Spanish translators, Spanish to English translators. It's quite a saturated market. And so in order to become trusted, I think that's probably the best way to put it, become known to and then trusted by a publisher, be that recommending a book, writing book reports, or just simply being hired to translate a book. That took me 10 years, really. And I think that when at that point, I was almost freer than I am now, because I was doing all the chasing of the literature. I was in my 20s, so I was reading probably more than I am able to read now, if I'm totally honest, with 2 children. And I was quick off the mark. So I was in contact with lots of literary agents, a lot of authors, because I was living in Mexico. I was having interaction with authors and getting to read their books quite early on. And that sort of fleetness of foot meant that I could, if I found something that I thought was really good, in my opinion, I was able to contact people quickly, and I was free to do the sample or to go to the London Book Fair and meet the agent or the publishers that I thought might be interested. So there was a sort of freedom just through circumstance, that, and also a real drive. I just really wanted to start to translate as many good books as possible, because I knew that I would get better doing it. And I also think that translating is a little bit like playing a game of tennis. If you're playing against someone who's better than you, then you up your game. You play better. And I think when you're translating authors who are really doing something, writing beautiful prose, or doing something new or stylistically like distinctive, and you have to emulate those things, you're raising your game always. So that's part one to your answer. So I was just kind of there on the scene as quickly as possible. Then part two of the answer now is where I am a little bit better known to a lot of publishers, not to all obviously, but to more, and so books are offered to me, and that's been quite interesting. It's taken me quite a long time, and I've been quite slow at learning what to say yes to and when to say no. Mostly when to say no is not just because I don't feel an affinity to the book, or I don't think it's very good. I mean, that's also true that sometimes you read things and that it's not that they're not good, but it's for you. They're not ticking the right boxes. They're not doing something that you need from a book. You're, as a freelancer, it's just really scary saying no to work. So there was a sort of middle period where I took on a few books that probably didn't really suit me and I didn't suit them, but they're out there in the world. Good books and some less good books, I suppose. But but now I've got 2 children, as I say. I only get to translate a couple of books a year, really. And so I have to choose well, because it's also my soul and sanity need to be fed by good works. And I'm able to choose now, which is an enormous privilege. I suppose it's a privilege that I've earned, but it's still a privilege.
Now, 20 novels that you have translated. 5 times you've been nominated for International Booker. So statistically speaking, that every year, if you do 4 translations, it's mandatory that you get nominated.
I think it would be too exhausting. I think I'd have to just only be awake for the couple of months of the prize being running, and then just hibernate for the rest of the year. Because every time you get your hopes up, because you hope, of course, that the book will go as far as possible, and because it's collaborative. And this is what I love about the International Booker Prize, because it's collaborative. You hope for your author that the book keeps going. It's not just for you. It's certainly not altruistic, because who doesn't want their book to be shortlisted, their translation to be shortlisted? But there's also this other side of you that's thinking, oh, if Vincenzo got shortlisted, I would be so happy for him, genuinely.
Oh, now we will come to the novel Perfection, the Italian novel that you translated into English. Just been shortlisted. I read the novel recently. It's a wonderfully translated novel and an interesting one too. So all these years you have been translating from Spanish. So why did you switch to Italian?
It's a good question. It's a bit like starting again.
It's okay.
I wasn't actively looking for an Italian book to translate yet. I must say that. But I had been speaking to Jacques Tastard, with whom I've worked quite a lot now. I've worked with Fitzcarraldo editions on the Fernanda Melchor books. And I also do some reader reports and things for Fitzcarraldo. So we're in contact. And we just finished Paradise by Fernanda Melchor, and then he told me about this book that he had bought in Italian, and he knows that I've been living in Italy for 5 years now, and he knows I have an Italian husband and speak Italian, and so he said, "Are you sort of ready?" And I wasn't sure that I was, but he said, well, read it and see if you are, read it and take a look and see. And honestly, at that point, what really appealed to me was what a challenge it would be, not even in terms of language. When I read it, I thought, no, I am ready. I'm ready to just take the jump and translate a full book from Italian now. But it was the fact that I was going from translating Fernanda Melchor, which are really vernacular novels, like lots of speaking, lots of speech, lots of dialogue, lots of...
Yes, there is not even a single dialogue in the book.
Yeah, and in this book, there's not a single piece of dialogue. And I always do like a challenge. So I realized that I had been translating a lot of works with a lot of dialogue, and sort of lots of slang and lots of swearing and lots of vernacular, basically. And I thought, well, this is something different. I've always thought that my weak point was describing things, because it's really hard to describe things to translate description. I don't know why, because it should be almost the most straightforward thing. But I've spoken to other translators who have agreed with me that one of the most difficult things to translate is the description of a room, the space of a room. And I often write to authors. Recently, I wrote to Alia Dragukozeran, and I also wrote to Vincenzo, and I said, can you just draw me a picture of the layout of this room so that I am able to know what you mean? Because he might say one corner, but I somehow need to know which corner it is, even if I'm not going to say add into the translation, the left-hand corner. I just need to know. It's really strange. It's almost like walking through the room blindfolded, unless you are able to picture it more clearly. So anyway, I said yes, really, because I wanted the challenge, and that's the long and short of it, really.
So you had any formal learning of Italian?
Yeah, I've done Italian courses and things, but I think the best way to learn a language, and how I've learned Spanish as well, was just existing in it. So I've been married, as I say, to an Italian, or been with my partner for over a dozen years now, and we have children who our household is bilingual. So we have children who speak to him in Italian. So and now we've been living in Italy for 5 years. So
Now, please introduce us to the novel Perfection.
So the novel Perfection is a sort of B-side, or a sort of response to the author Vincenzo Latronico's reading of a novel, the debut novel by Georges Perec, written in 1965, which is called Things, in translation by David Bellos. It's called Things, a story of the 60s. And in that, there's a couple called Sylvie and Jerome, and they are sort of entering into a relatively new professional world of market research in the 60s. And the novel follows them as if through a camera, and describes how they live in a lot of detail, in minute detail. But it describes how they live without ever entering into their thought processes. So we never hear their thoughts, very rarely, and we never hear them talking. And they're also described as a sort of homogenous they. So this couple don't have autonomous sort of, they're not like, the characterization is the one entity. And it explores their sort of desires and the possession, and how their desires are sort of exposed and flattened, I suppose, by their material possessions and the acquiring of more material possessions. And I think that, as I've understood it through talking to Vincenzo and hearing him talk about the novel, Perfection came about as a response to it, because he realized that this was there was almost a template there that would help to reveal something about the way the internet has changed a certain generation, which is essentially the millennial generation. So we're talking about from sort of 2010s, how it's changed the landscape of their work, but also their inner landscape of how they feel and think and exist in the world, and what their desires are. And so in Perfection, we get Anna and Tom, who are digital creatives instead of market researchers. And we follow them as they live in Berlin. They're not from Berlin. They're from an unnamed Southern European country. And they moved to Berlin because they want to be at the center of the scene. And then, as I say, also this couple are described as a they, which makes it sound like a rather vague portrait. But on the contrary, it's extremely precise. And descriptions, again, make up most of the novel, as you know. I think Berlin feels like another main character in this novel, because we learn all about what a sort of 20-something-year-old moving there in the 2010s expects and aspires to, why you would move to a city like Berlin in that moment. And ultimately, what happens is this kind of this abundance of cultural, social freedom. One reviewer called it intellectualized upward mobility. This freedom somehow slowly starts to trap them. So there is a plot. Maybe it's not a plot in the traditional sense, but we do follow them in time, and things do happen to them in the novel. But there's a sort of encroaching ennui in the tone and the feel and the descriptions, which mirrors the ennui that they are feeling as their life in Berlin doesn't exactly sour, but sort of stagnates somehow, because it begins extremely dynamically. They've got these friends that move into Berlin and then they move out again, and they're always at this art show or being seen at this place. They're getting high. They're spending entire weekends high so they can hardly remember what happened, and the week begins again, or time seems to disappear. Especially, I mean, I'll get to that, but especially because the internet dominates their life. It's almost like a disease in their life. It's not ever criticized, the internet, in the novel, not explicitly, but that's how I see it. And one of the things that I loved about this novel when I read it was how, without criticizing the internet, because there's really no point in criticizing the internet because it's here and it's here to stay, without it, what he does is he's able to reveal that it has changed our inner landscapes. It has changed the way we respond emotionally. It has changed our day-to-day lives. He writes so well on that.
Now, when I read the novel, I realized that the life of this couple, for that matter, even our lives, for the most part, what we desire and the way we want to live is actually influenced by the people that we may never meet.
Yes.
That's really fascinating, right?
Yeah, he has that. Do you remember that episode in the novel where he describes getting the pair of them read some sort of Twitter storm, and how much that one comment made by one person on Twitter that becomes a viral Twitter storm, how much that encroaches on their single day, on their physical space, how they are, what they eat, their mood. And he says in the novel, there's a line, he says, even their moods were new, which is why these moods had no commonly recognized name. He's very good on the kind of entropic experience of the internet, because we all know that it's driven by algorithms. There's nothing really random about the internet anymore, but it feels so random and it feels so chaotic. He also says, like, being online now, it was like walking through the world's most hectic street market on cocaine.
Yeah. The novel, the way it's written, the author gives a lot of details, a lot of lovely details, as if, he will make the reader go and sit in the same room with the couple. And other than that, for every 15 or 20 pages, he just makes an observation, in a very, very subtle way. It appears as if he's not being judgmental. At the same time, he is being judgmental about it. By the way, have you read the novel by George Spirek?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I've read it in translation because my French is not particularly good. So yes, I read the David Bellos translation, and David Bellos is a translator that I admire greatly, and the translation is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And then I did actually look at that translation more closely again, because there were certain lines in it that after I translated the book, Vincenzo pointed out and underscored a few lines that he had not taken verbatim, but he had used almost as a template. He wanted a few echoes to the French, because he reads French, and so I made a few echoes to the Bellos translation, the translation. They're never the same lines, but they might have a similar beginning or a similar end, or just a similar rhythm sometimes, actually. And that was really fun as a translator to go into that kind of level of detail, and that sort of metafictional, I quite enjoy all of that, looking at what, like, little tricks and little things that the reader won't ever know and no one will ever notice, but you've done, and you've done them, and they sort of help polish everything.
One more interesting part for me is the way these two, they respond to 2015 migration crisis. It's written very interestingly. That too, they get influenced by the social media.
I think Vincenzo at a certain point talks about an online ethical process. So the way people might respond on social media to a crisis that's happening thousands of miles away from them, and yet is very much happening also in their home, because it's on the front page of their news, and it's in their Twitter feed and on Instagram and all over the place. So opinions are there, images are there. So it's at once nothing to do with them and everything to do with them. And how to respond to that in a practical way is a quandary that I think that we are all dealing with, regardless of whether you're a millennial or not. Whoever's online has to deal with that. And that sense of sort of hopelessness that it's there every day in front of your face. I think that in the book, as if I remember, there's a part just before the Syrian migrants arrive in Germany and Anna and Tom have to deal with them with what kind of response they're going to come up with in real life. Just before that, they talk about, Vincenzo has lines about how the images of the dinghies crossing the Mediterranean had become another part of their sort of information landscape. It no longer had an emotional impact on them, and they would sort of process them visually as they would. He says the wars in the Middle East or smoke grenades at the G8 protests. So somehow there's a numbing and a deadening that's gone on because of the amount of exposure to images of these crises. And then there's but at the same time, and why I like this book as well, because it contradicts you. So you would think that what might help is a sort of real life experience, like somehow, right, okay, getting our hands dirty and really helping these migrants is going to be the way to resolve that, and everything will suddenly, our lives will have purpose. But actually it's an image that also galvanizes them to do that. It's the image of Alan Kurdi.
Yes, the photograph.
Exactly. It's the photograph of Alan Kurdi, who drowned and was washed up on European shores. And that was an era-defining photograph. And in the book, it's described as such. And then Germany opens its borders to lots of Syrian refugees. And at that point, Tom and Anna have to decide how they're going to respond in real life. And much to their annoyance almost, they find that none of their skills are particularly transferable in the circumstance. And so, and when they do think that there is maybe a transferable skill, like, for example, there's this idea to make a phrase book for the new arrivals. So they could make it clearer, being digital creatives and knowing their way around, knowing how to create visually, work with visual fonts and typefaces and things like that. They're like, right, okay, this is us. This is our part in this. This is how we could be really useful. And then they go to do it, and of course, someone else has already done it. And then Vincenzo hammers it home even harder without ever criticizing anyone. But the saddest point is then at the end, when they realize that them standing around in these reception centers, they're getting in the way more than they're really helping anyone. And they look down on the floor one day, and in the mud, there's one of these phrase books just kind of trampled on in the mud, because, of course, the migrants also have their smartphones, and that's where they're going to get their translations if they need to.
Now, the author is also a translator. He translates from Italian to English. How is the experience working with him?
Oh, it was brilliant. It was so good.
And interestingly, in the end remarks, he said, you wrote the book as much as he did. That's a wonderful compliment for a translator.
Yeah, it is a compliment. Of course, I would add like a kind of, I'd put a PS at the end of, well, I didn't write any of it. I didn't write any of it in some senses, but I know what he means. And I certainly put in a lot of care at sentence level to what was going on. And I suppose also every now and again there are things that come up in even brilliant novels where you think they could be clearer. I don't mean this it could be clearer to an Anglophone reader. I just mean it could be clearer, full stop. And then at that point, luckily, I was in contact with him. And so he was very keen on the idea of the translation influencing the original becoming something new as a result. And he had translated some of the book himself, like he had translated the book in self-translated, not with any view to publishing it, but because he felt that he exists a lot of the time in English, having lived in Berlin himself. He's fluent in English, and a lot of his friendships are conducted in English, and a lot of his life is conducted in English. So there's a part of him, a bit like what I was saying at the top of the podcast, there's a part of him that feels like Vincenzo in other language, in English too, as well as in Italian. And so as a result, he felt that by working backwards from my translation and thinking about his own translation back to his own translation of the work, I think he felt that that could then, as a result, that kind of moving through the translation process could take him to the original Italian sentence that he really wanted to write. And so that sort of openness to translation being something generative is extremely rare to come across when you're translating something. And I don't expect it from an author for them to be like, oh, your translation will change my original. Like, in no way do I expect that. But in this specific case, because he's a translator and he knows what it takes to translate, the level of detail and of concentration, and also of reading a book and knowing it at a micro level and then at a macro level, because you have to read it so many times. There are so many drafts at the end of the translation process. So you know it so intimately and kind of expansively that it can, if you want it to, also change the original or improve it almost, in a way that an edit does.
And I believe, certain themes, some stories, they work better in some languages. Probably this works better in English than in Italian.
Yeah, they definitely happen. Well, a lot of this novel in the Italian was in English because it was tech speak. So not a lot of it, but, there are certain lines that were already in English.
Yeah, there are a lot of technical terms, a lot of tech jargon in the book. CSS, programming languages, and all that.
Yeah, don't remind me. That was a nightmare because I'm a total... But in terms of the translation, it's an interesting point because I did have to talk to my techie, digital creative friends and check that I wasn't saying complete nonsense in English. So that was all quite fun.
In one of your interviews, you said you love translating dialogue, but this novel is constructed quite differently. There is no dialogue, and it appears as if it's a plotless novel, though there is an underlying serious plot. So was your approach in translating the novel any different from your previous work?
My approach wasn't different. I think I was a little bit nervous, a bit trepidatious about the amount of description. And I was extremely worried, and this is a real true story, that I began translating the book and after a month I hadn't got past, and I'm really not exaggerating, the first paragraph. I became fixated with the first paragraph of this novel. I was obsessed that it must read so beautifully in English. But there is so much detail in even the first sentence. It's just detail piled on top of detail. And in Italian, for example, you put the adjectives, before the noun, and in English, you put them afterwards. I think little things like that would mean that you really had to reconstruct that first paragraph in order to emulate the beauty and the lyricism, really, of the description in the original, but also get every single detail in. And I felt that if I could crack that first paragraph, which is maybe 6 lines, I could do the whole novel. And it didn't take me a month per paragraph after that. It did take me quite a long time to translate this book. I think it was because there was no dialogue. Because usually with dialogue, I can just hear it in my head. Once I've read the book, I always read the book first, and I get to know the characters by reading the book first, and then I'll sort of reread a page before I translate it, and I can just hear them, and so it almost comes out as if I'm acting the part. But there was no acting to do here, because even the narrative voice is quite neutral. It's not boring at all. It's very eloquent, but it's neutral to me. So lots of people say that this book feels scathing, but I don't think at any point there's anything scathing about the tone of it. It's just, I think the incisiveness of his observations is what feels painful.
Yeah, there is no sarcasm involved anywhere.
No. And that was a shame for me, because I quite like all that acting in translation. I think I wouldn't say I'm particularly like flamboyant, but I like to do that when I'm translating. Whereas here, there was a sort of evenness the whole way through. And sometimes I did have days where I think, I just can't describe what's on another shelf, like I just can't just do this today, because it's just, I felt somehow it was hard to see what it was all building to some days, because I think I've only just described what's on a shelf all day. What's going on, and is this going to work, this novel? And then, because I'd sort of forgotten, and taking it line by line and scene by scene like that, I was worried really that my translation would, like, the beauty of the English wouldn't carry it like I felt that it had with the Italian, or I just worried that it wouldn't work, I suppose. And then I got to the end and realized that it did, to my relief.
Now, this is the last question I wanted to ask you. What do you think these two are chasing?
But I think they're chasing perfection, because I think that's what they've been sold. I think that's what they have been told that they're able to achieve, because they are the Instagram generation, and they have, at this moment in their lives, they have no great worries. They have enough money, they have a solid enough job, they have friends, and they have each other. And they don't have children to worry about, and so all they want is what's being sold to them online and through this slightly kind of like slightly homogenous urban, like, cosmopolitan city that Berlin is shown to be by the end of the novel. And so I think they're looking for perfection. And then I think another thing, by the end of the novel, I found it quite sad, really, because in a way I feel like they're sort of searching for calm in the madness. Like I said, there's something sort of there's a sort of entropy entropy reigns supreme on the internet. Certainly as a user, that's how it's experienced. And so they're looking for something calmer and more settled and more rooted. And those last lines of the novel, which I won't share, and that last scene of them in their newfound safe haven away from the great big city and the online world, that they cannot escape it, because then with the last lines you realize that that's also going to define their experience as in their new roles, not as digital creatives anymore.
Now, would you please read the first page from the novel for us?
Present. Sunlight floods the room from the bay window, reflects off the wide honey-coloured floorboards, and casts an emerald glow over the perfect leaves of a monstera shaped like a cloud. Its stems brush the back of a Scandinavian armchair, an open magazine left face down on the seat. The red of that magazine cover, the plant's brilliant green, the petrol blue of the upholstery, and the pale ochre floor stand out against the white walls, their chalky tone picked up again in the pale rug that just creeps into the frame. The next picture is of the building's exterior, an Art Nouveau apartment block with acanthus leaf and citrus fruit cornices. The white render is all but invisible under layers of fluorescent graffiti, tattered posters, and peeling paint. On the first floor, you can scarcely make out the stucco tympanums beneath the grime. The combination of turn-of-the-century luxury and raw modern grittiness lends a feeling of freedom and decadence, with a hint of eroticism. Some of the windows are boarded up with faded chipboard, but in others there are plants and string lights. An ivy cascades from a balcony onto the street below. The kitchen is fitted out with glossy white subway tiles, a chunky wooden worktop, a double butler's sink. Open shelves are lined with blue and white enamel dishes, and mason jars filled with rice, grains, coffee, spices. Cast iron pans and olive wood ladles hang from a wall-mounted steel bar. Out on display on the worktop are a brushed steel kettle, a Japanese teapot, and a bright red blender. The windowsill is filled with herbs growing in terracotta pots, basil, mint, chives, but also marjoram, winter savoury, coriander, dill. Pushed against one wall is an antique marble-top pastry table and salvaged chairs. They are lit by an accordion wall light mounted between a botanical lithograph and a reproduction print of a British wartime post.